Good. Well, then today we're going to talk about fascism. I've got a... Yeah, maybe you've gotten the idea already, but guess what? The 20th century was not all fun and games. And really, for the next few weeks, it's going to be more depressing than usual. Okay? We've got the Great Depression. We've got fascism, the rise of Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, what Stalin did in the Soviet Union. Then we've got World War II, which puts the claim for the First World War to be a really world war to shame. And we've got the Holocaust. We've got just mass destruction, death, all over the place. So normally I think of myself as a very witty professor. I think of myself as funny. It's hard to be funny about some of the stuff coming up. I'll do my best. Okay? But still, there's not going to be a lot of, so, Stalin, the Gulag, so anyway, bear with me. This is kind of depressing in places. The rise of fascism in Italy is actually maybe less depressing than some of the other things. It's not really until he becomes a close buddy of Hitler that Mussolini veers off into things that are really repulsive. However, fascism by itself isn't that fun. Let's introduce ourselves to the guy who really put fascism on the map. Benito Mussolini. He was born in 1883, died in 1945, not coincidentally. He started out as a socialist journalist. He was the editor of a magazine called The Future of the Worker. He became a leader of the Italian Socialist Party. His parents were socialists, and he followed in their footsteps. He saw himself as continuing the cause of the revolution. He took over the government of Italy just shortly after the First World War in 1922, after the March on Rome. You might remember that Italy entered the war on the side of the Allies and fought a series of battles against Austria-Hungary. It's a front in the war that we don't talk about much. In fact, over the weekend I read a blog post where people said, look, most of the fighting in World War I took place in Belgium and northeastern France. Well, on what we think of as the Western Front, that's true. But there were bloody battles on the Eastern Front in Turkey, around Gallipoli, around the Dardanelles. And there were also bloody battles on the Isonzo River, which separates, or separated anyway at the time, Austria-Hungary from Italy. Now, there were 11 such battles, and the worst of them took something like 50,000 lives. These were incredibly bloody, difficult battles. So we don't tend to think about it much. Italy was actually heavily involved in the First World War and suffered tremendously from it. That meant the government was weak. People really didn't have much allegiance to it. They saw it as having led them into disaster in the First World War. Through electoral means, Mussolini wasn't really able to accomplish much. So he led a march on Rome, basically to show the power of his new fascist movement that demanded a new kind of leadership. Here he is, once he arrived in Rome, the march on Rome. And that's the kind of stance you often see him in. He was a small man. Nevertheless, he wants you to know he's tough. So if he were standing here, he wouldn't be standing as I am right now. He'd be standing like this. Next we do! In that sort of voice. That was the kind of guy he was, and you see there some of his top leaders who are, well, yeah, I don't know how to describe those expressions, actually. He did win an election 2 years later, so he sought power by legitimate means. The March on Rome was really to show his power, and he became informally the leader of Italy at that point. But he did get elected to office in 1924 as president. He discouraged dissent through violence and intimidation. Those guys whose expressions I found it hard to read, they would go through the streets and make sure you were pro-Mussolini or else. Here you see a large M with his fascist symbol, the fasces, meant to indicate power. The M, of course, for Mussolini. And here is a typical scene of him giving a speech. Oh. Below is a crowd that is in the square, numbering tens of thousands of people. Okay, the next year, 1925, he declared himself Il Duce, the leader. Okay, he dismantled all restraints on power. And here is some art of the period, a mosaic. Duce, 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 Duce. Okay, leader, 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 leader. 8 times. He's not just the leader, he's the leader, the leader, the leader, etc., etc. Okay, here he is in his office. With his cat. So, he had some good qualities. He loved cats. Okay, as I've mentioned, his parents were socialists, also considered themselves anarchists, which is an interesting combination. They were deeply influenced by Marx, and by Nietzsche, actually, and Mussolini was too. He referred to Marx as the father and teacher, the magnificent philosopher of working class violence. But actually Mussolini talked about violence much more than he practiced it, until, at any rate, he became best buddies with Hitler by the late 30s and began to copy Hitler's methods and tactics. So he was somebody who preached violence while actually, for the most part, getting by on just threats of violence. He considered himself a follower of Georges Sorel. Sorel was a French Marxist philosopher who in 1908 wrote a book called Reflections on Violence. He advocated a position he thought of as revolutionary syndicalism. Now, what on earth does that mean? It's a kind of complicated combination of ideas. But basically the idea is that it stresses the virtue of violence, first of all. It says that social change has to be accompanied by violence. By the way, what artistic movement was just getting born around 1908? Futurism, yeah. So there's a strong tie between Marinetti and some of the other futurists, who noticed in many cases were Italian, and Mussolini and other theorists who were partly behind this. In any case, he also believed strongly in the power of social myths. So he was somebody who didn't, like Marx, stress simply deterministic economic forces, that people were pawns of social forces much larger than they were. No, he said, in fact, there are social myths, social ideas that have tremendous power, and one of the things he thought that you have to do to bring about the revolution is tell the right kind of story. You have to build up a certain kind of narrative, and a narrative that has real mythic power. That will have more influence on people's lives than actual economic conditions. So he said it's not really a question of exactly what's going on in what Marx would have considered the material basis of society. It's more a question of what's going on in people's minds. And that's something you can shape by building up these myths, these stories, these narratives that are going to have a tremendous amount of power to shape the way people think about things. So Mussolini was influenced by that, thought that's right. There's something that Marx left out, which is the power of ideas, the power of the narrative, of the story, of the myth that controls the way people think about their own realities. Now, there is still a movement of revolutionary syndicalism. Here you see a poster in France for this movement, and it has a website notice, so this is still around as a movement. In any case, he did diverge from Marx in some ways that are familiar, but in one really fundamental way. First of all, like Lenin, he said that the revolution isn't going to come on its own. There will need to be a revolutionary elite, a group of people who will develop the social myth, who will tell the narrative, who will not only develop proletarian consciousness in the sense of making people aware of their conditions, but tell them a story to make a certain kind of sense of it and to get them interested in revolution. Secondly, he rejected Marx's materialism. He thought Sorel was right. The power of ideas, of myths, of stories, of narratives is very important. And so he rejected Marx's materialism and his economic determinism. He said, no, there is an independent power of ideas, of myths. Those are an important part of how a society functions and how people act, and so they have to be recognized in a part of a theory. They aren't just economics, and they aren't just material things. But here's the final one, which was really the more fundamental break. Here is where he diverged from not only Marx, but Lenin and Sorel and a variety of other people. He rejected the idea of class struggle. He said, look, if all the conditions that matter are economic, and if we're really just pawns of economic forces, then indeed, really there's nothing to understand about history except the way in which these economic forces interact. And so you can think about the whole history of the world as being a history of class struggle. But if you reject that economic determinism, if ideas have a separate importance, if it matters what kind of story you tell, what kind of myths people believe in, how they understand themselves, in other words, then this idea of class struggle doesn't really make any sense. That can't be the sole driving condition of history, even if it's one of the things that makes a difference. Yeah?
I don't really understand myths. Like, is he just lying to people?
Myths. Okay, good. What does he mean by myths? Yeah. All right, good. What are some things that function as myths or stories or narratives in contemporary politics? Oh, this is scary. If contemporary politics is too scary, let's jump back to the history of things. Let's jump back to World War I. We've talked about that. What kind of myth, for example, did President Wilson tell? Now, by the way, in saying myth, that implies that, oh, it's all false. I don't really mean it to imply that, and Sorel didn't mean that. To be a powerful myth, to be a powerful story or narrative, it's got to have at least some elements of truth. So it's really just a story you tell. So let's think of it that way. what kind of story was told in the United States, or in Britain, or in Germany about World War I? Yeah.
We're fighting for freedom and trying to protect ourselves against the baby stabbing Germans.
Okay, good. We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting to make the world safe for democracy. We're fighting, especially in the British propaganda, against those Germans who want to stab our babies. Right? They're coming with bayonets, and the posters show them bayoneting babies and hold them like, aha, see, this is what the Hun will do. And so that's part of the story, right? And part of the reason World War I actually got very difficult to end once the leadership realized that it was all pointless and was all a stalemate, is that they had told their publics these stories, right? How do you say, the Germans are evil, the Germans want to stab your babies, the Germans want to steal all our food, the Germans want to take our women and slaughter our men and do them. And then it's like, oh, but they've offered a peace terms, I think we should agree and negotiate that, right? That's pretty difficult. What about within Germany? What kind of story were the Germans telling? It's pretty much the same thing in reverse, right? Look what those British are trying to do. Look what the French are trying to do. And so it was pretty much the same narrative, but with different heroes and different villains. Now, what Wilson did in the United States that was a bit different is that he really did make it ideological. It was about democracy. It was about freedom, he said. Even though, when you look at the history of how the war developed, it didn't seem to have much to do with any of those things at all. But that was part of the story. It was part of the narrative. Now, in that sense, it's a myth because it has it gives you basic categories in terms of which people think about the world. That doesn't necessarily mean it's false. It might be false. It might be just a story. But there are elements of myths that are true. Even in ancient Greek myths, there are some things that are actually true. Maybe those gods don't exist. But still, somebody starts saying, yeah, what's something that would actually be true in a myth? What might a myth try to explain?
Natural phenomena?
Good, natural phenomena. Maybe you're trying to explain, I don't know, thunderstorms, right? Well, part of the myth is there are thunderstorms. It's like, that's true, right? That's not made up. So there are going to be elements of these stories that are true. There might be elements that are false. Basically, ones that have a lot of staying power, you might think, had better be true, at least in large part, or people are going to see through them. But in any case, it's things like that. Now, what actually gets told to people? Well, Mussolini, as we'll see, tells a certain story. And he thinks that story is very, very important. But it does imply that class struggle can't be everything. Because after all, that's an economic sort of struggle. But if it's not all economics, then it's not all class struggle. Something else is going on. And so there are a number of respects in which Mussolini is a heretic from the point of view of orthodox Marxism. Some of them are ones where he shares views with Lenin. He believes in vanguard minorities. They're small, trained, dedicated elites. And what they do is raise the consciousness of the proletariat. So in that respect, he sounds just like Lenin. He thinks violence will be necessary. Again, just like Lenin. He wants to prepare the proletariat for the greatest bloodbath of all. Well, that phrase is actually from Mussolini, not from Lenin, but it sounds like it could easily be Lenin, right? So in those respects, he varies from orthodox Marxism. He also is opposed to reformism, trade union consciousness, democracy. He sees the party as having a very important role, and it's got to be centralized, it's got to be hierarchical, it's got to be highly disciplined, in its early stages, secret. He thinks the proletariat won't organize itself. He wants the leadership of professional revolutionaries. He thinks they can bring about this consciousness and bring about the revolution, that in the end, violence is necessary and that organized violence will win out. So in all those respects, he's really a Leninist. Well then, why does Mussolini diverge in other ways? Why does he end up in a different position? Well, answer is, he rejects the idea of the class struggle. He starts with this thought, really, which is Marx plus Nietzsche, which is the class struggle plus the will to power. Right? Plus the idea that this elite, that a leader can come on the scene and exercise power of will to bring about the revolution. And so all of that he agrees with. But now he sees what the Russian Revolution brings. Okay, the Russian Revolution occurs in 1917. Mussolini is observing all this. He's been a socialist journalist by then for some time. He's starting to think about, but has not yet organized, the March on Rome. And he sees what happens in Russia. Unlike lots of Western observers who closed their eyes to it or believed the press stories that everything was wonderful, Lincoln Steffens, I've been over into the future and it works. No, he sees things are a disaster. And we've talked about this. I've already shown you this slide, but just to remind you, Petrograd lost 72% of its population. 3 million people died of starvation in the winter of 1921-22. In 1920, as opposed to before the war in 1913, iron production in Russia was down to 2% of what it had been. Manufactured goods, 13% of what it had been. People were starving. So, Mussolini saw that. And he said, all right, look, that didn't work, okay? We've seen what happens if you actually have organized violence and it brings about a revolution. It leads to disaster. And so he adapts his ideas. He rejects the idea of class struggle, and he does something else. He says, let's try to unify proletariat, bourgeoisie, other classes in a different way, by uniting them in the nation. So, why did things reach such disastrous proportions in Russia? What went wrong? Why did that violent revolution lead to such overwhelming destruction? Destruction really of the whole economy, of agriculture, of manufacturing, of heavy machinery, and so on and so forth. Yeah? Good. Part of it is the socialist dilemma. You tell people, listen, from now on, comrade, your crops that you grow will not be eaten by you. They will go for the good of the state. What's your incentive to grow crops, right? Maybe eventually you turn into a socialized humanist who says, I will do it all for the good of mankind, but that's not going to happen overnight. And so we've got this problem that the farmers stop growing anything. That's one difficulty. What other difficulties are there? One of them Mussolini's very sensitive to. What's the whole idea? Marx has this picture of class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. How does it get resolved?
Kill bourgeoisie.
You kill the bourgeoisie, exactly. Yes, you have violent revolution and you destroy the bourgeois class. That's the whole idea of Lenin's thing. You've got to exterminate the bourgeoisie as a class. Well, who are the bourgeoisie?
Rich people.
Well, rich people, but who else?
Educated people.
Educated people, who else?
The people who own the means of production.
The people who own the means of production. And also, you know, there are the owners, the factory owners, let's say. But then the factory owners employ lots of people to be their agents, right? They hire managers, they hire accountants, they hire the people who are the bosses. Now, those bosses aren't exactly proletarians, but they aren't exactly bourgeoisie either. They don't really own the means of production, but they're the agents of those who own the means of production. And so they occupy a weird position. Suppose you kill them all, as Lenin basically did. If you were somebody who was educated, if you were somebody who was a school teacher, if you were somebody who had been in any kind of managerial position or an army officer or anything like that. Now, what happens once you kill everybody who's been running things?
Disaster.
Yeah, disaster, because nobody knows how to run anything, okay? Nobody knows how anything works. What happens when the workers come to the factory and everybody says, the bosses are gone, we've killed them all? Right? They're like, oh, well, okay, what do we do? Oh, no, that guy used to tell us what to do? He's gone. We can do whatever we want. Okay, what happens in a factory when everyone does whatever they want? What would happen in the university? Suppose somebody kills all the faculty and just says to the students, now, comrades, we have implemented the revolution, do what you want. How well would that work out?
That won't work.
I mean, it might be fun for a while, but it's really not going to be great educationally, and so on. And the same thing happens here. So he realizes, wait, you destroy the bourgeoisie, you destroy everybody who knows how anything works. So he stresses unity. He stresses getting beyond politics. And he rejects Marx's material. He says fascism is the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the doctrine of historic materialism, which would explain the history of mankind in terms of the class struggle, and by changes in the processes and instruments of production to the exclusion of all else. He's going to admit that some of those economic factors are important, that there are social classes, that sometimes they struggle, but he says that's not the full story of everything, that's not the whole history of the world, there's a lot of other stuff going on too. So he says that the vicissitudes of economic life, raw materials, new technical processes, scientific inventions have their importance, no one denies. But that they suffice to explain human history to the exclusion of other factors is absurd. Fascism believes now and always in sanctity and heroism. That is to say, in acts which don't have any economic motive. And so his idea really is that people act sometimes for economic reasons, but sometimes for non-economic reasons. Probably there are things you do purely for economic reasons. Like what?
Work.
Get a job, right? You might get a job while you're in school, help pay for your education. Probably it's not, I mean, maybe it's a job you'd want to do anyway, but probably not. I worked in an apartment complex during summers when I was in college. I was the guy who basically replaced anyone who went on vacation. So one week I'd be mowing the lawn and doing the weeding and all of that. The next week I'd be painting apartments. The next week I'd be cleaning floors. One summer, the worst summer. This was a 27-story building, and it had white vinyl walls. And my job for the entire summer was to just scrub by hand, all 27 floors of white vinyl walls. That was awful. I mean, it sometimes got interrupted by cutting the lawns and doing stuff like that, or fixing air conditioning units. Actually, that was really bad too, because I got a crick in my neck that lasted for about 5 years from doing this a lot. But the white walls were psychologically the worst. I delighted when there was a floor with a smoker, because they were dirty. It was like, awesome, what I'm doing will make a difference. But if it was a floor where there were no smokers, it was kind of like, crap, it looks the same when I'm done. Okay? But was I the kind of guy who would just say, oh yeah, I already did floor 13 when I hadn't? No. Anyway, it was very depressing. But there are lots of things we do that are not for economic motives, right? What are some things you do that aren't based on economic motives?
Play sports.
Play sports, okay, good. You might play sports. You play intramural football, let's say, or soccer or something like that. Do you do it because you think, hey, I'm going to be discovered? You know, maybe I'll make it to the NFL by playing on the philosophy department team? No. What are some other things you do, not from an economic motive?
Social issues.
Okay, you might be involved in social issues. You might, let's say, volunteer for some social agency. You don't do it because you're getting paid or for economic reasons. What other things might you do, other than economic motives?
Go to college.
Go to college. Yeah, take a philosophy course, okay? Probably not an economic motive. Could be. I mean, philosophers get rich. Look at me. Yeah. Well, anyway, back to reality. What are other things you do? Not for economic motives.
Watch TV.
Watch TV. Yeah, you're not being paid to watch TV, right? You probably don't think, oh yeah, I think I'll watch The Big Bang Theory. You know, that employers really like that if you can make Sheldon Cooper jokes. Other things you do, not for an economic motive.
Facebook?
Facebook. Good, Facebook. You do that, but it's not something that pays you. Good, you fall in love, you get married. You probably aren't doing it for an economic motive. I mean, you might be. You might say, hey, my goal is to marry into a rich family, and hey, she's cute and she has lots of money, so yeah, maybe, but most people don't do it for that sort of reason. Other things.
Have a pet.
Have a pet. Yes, I have cats. Do I do it for economic reasons? Do I think, whoa, maybe this is the cat that'll really pay off? No. Okay, so there's a lot of life that is really dominated by things that have no economic motive. And Mussolini says, look, to try to say somehow all of these are in some hidden way controlled by economics is ridiculous. There's a lot else going on. But if that's true, he says, we have to reject the idea of class struggle. So here's Marx's idea. We've got the bourgeoisie, we've got the proletariat, and how do we solve the class struggle? Cross out the bourgeoisie.
Yep.
Here is the fascist picture, according to Mussolini. We unite bourgeoisie and proletariat together in something larger, something that can encompass both, something that can inspire both, and lead both to do something besides promote their own self-interest, and that thing is the state. So we unite them in the state, in the nation. So fascism is something he sees as essentially nationalistic. Here's how we can get bourgeoisie and proletarians to work together. Get them to work together for a greater Italy. Or, in Hitler's case, a greater Germany. Or a greater United States. Or a greater Argentina. It doesn't matter what it is, really. The question is we have to find something they have in common. Something that can serve as an important ideal for both. Now, is it going to be a particular social class? No. They're divided. But what do they have in common? They're Italians, okay? The Italian owners of the means of production and the Italian workers have this in common, they're Italian. And so we can unite them for the cause of a greater Italy. The idea is to find something that can unite them. Now the Marxist says ultimately, well, it's really the world. Okay, workers of all countries unite. Fascists like Mussolini say that's too big. If you say, hey look, work to improve the world. Here's what it is. You're a citizen of the world. Make it a better world. Now some people are idealistic enough to respond to that. But the fascists say most people aren't. That's just not generally going to work. Some people are going to say, yes, I'll sign up, I want it to be a better world. But a lot of people can't really identify with that. I mean, we just had a bunch of football games this weekend, right? You were probably cheering for a team. I was at a bar watching Pittsburgh play. Who did they play? I don't. Who cares? They won. But here's what matters. I identify with that particular team, right? The Pittsburgh Steelers. Maybe you identify with the Dallas Cowboys, or the Houston Texans, or the New Orleans Saints, or whatever it is. Okay, but that's something you can identify with. Identify with. Suppose we had a new NFL team that represented the world. It's just, I don't know, the world algae or whatever. Okay, who's going to say that's my team? Yeah, I'm for the world. Maybe some people, but that's too far away. For most of us, we can identify with our city, with our state, with our nation. But can we identify with something larger? How many of you identify as North Americans? You say, well, yes, I was born in the United States, but really I'm a North American. I mean, I see myself as at one with Canada. I mean, maybe, but probably not, says the fascist. That's too big, right? Now I think with some continents, maybe people do that. You could see yourself as African, for example, or maybe as Central American in a way that transcends your country. So some units might work at that level, but the fascist says most units at that level aren't going to work. You've got to find something at any rate that does. Now, here is his solution. The key is everything within the state. Nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. So we have to unify the social classes and get them committed to the state. He thinks that's the best level. And everything has to be subsumed within the state. Everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. That means the fascist is going to see as a threat a lot of things in society that could be viewed as outside the state. What, for example? What are some things that are outside the state, outside the government? Here by the state, he doesn't just mean the country. He really means the country as organized into a political unit.
The church.
The church, good. So the church becomes an enemy. In fact, one of his first acts is to seize the lands of the church, okay? Because the church is a force outside the state. And so it's something that has to be destroyed, or at least carefully limited, or else it could disrupt this idea that everything must be within the state. What else is a potential threat?
International artists.
Yes. Say it again?
Artists.
Good, artists. All of those who see themselves as highly individual or are pursuing goals that have nothing in particular to do with the state, right? So the individual artist who says, look, I'm just doing my thing. No, you're supposed to be serving the interests of the state. Somebody else said international things. What about international organizations? What about the communist dream of world revolution and a world government that would control things? That's an enemy too. So enemies can be within the state, sort of smaller than the state, but they can also be larger. And so the fascist is typically going to oppose communism for seeking this international union, but it's also going to be opposed, for example, to the church, to private organizations, to private artists who are pursuing their own visions, to anything like that that doesn't serve the interests of the state within. So anything smaller than the state, anything larger than the state has to be attacked. Other suggestions for things like this, yeah?
Philosophers?
Philosophers, yeah. Philosophers are kind of weird, yes, good. Philosophers are kind of weird, and do they serve the interests of the state?
Maybe.
Well, sometimes they do, right? But sometimes they don't. And so that suggests you're going to have to control thought very carefully. The artists, the philosophers, the writers, the literary figures, the thinkers, the opinion journalists, all of those people are going to have to be monitored very carefully, because they're going to tend to get ideas, some of which support the state, and some of which are actually inimical to the state. And so the fascist says we're going to have to control journalism, the media, education, the arts very, very carefully. And so the idea of freedom of expression in any of those realms is going to be thrown out the window. Too much likelihood of somebody emerging as an enemy to the state. Well, he says no individuals or groups, and that means political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes will be outside the state. So we're not going to be allowed to organize into any kind of association, except for the state. But in addition to that, yeah, well, we'll have to have careful controls. We'll look at that when we get to his practical ideas. Now, the Marxists immediately labeled fascism a movement of the political right. On the other hand, and to some extent, he clearly was to the right of Lenin, I think, but still it's very similar to Marxism, right? And so is this really a right-wing movement or a left-wing movement? Now, actually, I think that's a very hard question to address, partly because it's not clear what right and left even mean. Part of my evidence for this is just Facebook. I have various Facebook friends who are always posting things like somebody over the weekend saying, Obama is a centrist, he's not on the left. In fact, no Democrats are left who are on the left. And somebody else started arguing with that person saying that's ridiculous. And I quickly came to the conclusion, these people are just using these terms in different ways. I mean, I think the one meant you can't be on the left unless you're calling for violent revolution. And the other thought, no, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the size of government and so on, and the role of government. And so it was like, you're just using the terms in different ways, guys. I've learned to try to stay out of Facebook political fights. Yeah. I spent some time, the idea was to stay in touch with friends, not alienate all my friends. And so now I've blocked a lot of people who upset me. I hid them. They still think they're friends of mine, but I never see them because they'll just piss me off. So anyway, before we leave this topic, what on earth do they mean? What does right wing mean, for example?
Well, at that time or right now?
Like right now.
Political.
Because, forget what Mussolini thought he was doing and where he'd locate himself on his political spectrum. That's sort of a difficult historical question. But let's think just where we want to locate this movement. Yeah?
It can either mean Tea Party or it can mean just basically trying to limit government to be smaller. And there are people who think that government should go really far right-wing, which is Tea Party, and then there's a bit less right-wing, which is because government should be smaller and we should not control the economy as much. There's a lot there.
Right. Okay, good. So yeah, in contemporary American politics, right tends to mean wanting smaller government, right? Meaning a greater sphere of individual rights and liberties, a smaller sphere of government powers and privileges. And so how far that's to go, you've got some Republicans who sort of want to go a little bit smaller. You've got some Republicans who want to go a lot smaller. But the idea is to create a greater space for the individual and a smaller space for government. What is left-wing in contemporary politics? Yeah.
More centralized power.
Okay, good. More centralized power. More power for government, less than for the individual, assuming that there's a kind of opposition between their spheres of control. So that would be, I think, how I would tend to mean these terms in contemporary politics. On the other hand, they tend to be used in all sorts of other ways. What are other things that right and left might mean? Yeah?
You could talk about being conservative, being right, or being more liberal, being left.
Okay, conservative and liberal, and those correlate to something about the role of government and roles of the individual, but they aren't exactly the same. There's another sort of thing that happens. For example, people will refer to the mullahs in Iran as conservative. Does that mean they want a small government? They believe in individual rights? They're like Tea Party members who say, cut taxes? Well, no, right? It means they're opposed to change. They're people who represent the old guard. And so there's also this opposed to change, want change meaning of these terms. And so it gets very confusing very quickly. And I've concluded, after listening to some of these discussions and partaking in some of them myself, to abandon these terms. So let me go back to my distinction from earlier in the course between bottom-up theories and top-down theories. A bottom-up theory says that government gets its rights, its freedoms, its powers, its privileges from the people. Okay? So typically the slogan of the bottom-up theorist is, governments can govern legitimately, but only with the consent of the governed. The idea is the government's getting its power from the people. A top-down theory says that people get their rights, freedoms, powers, and privileges from the government. And so Locke is the paradigm case of a bottom-up theorist. Rousseau, the paradigm case of a top-down theorist. For Rousseau, you get one chance, basically, in the social contract to grant powers to the government, but the moment you sign your name, boom, it's all top-down. In Marx, you don't even get that one chance. It's really all top-down from the very beginning. Now, from this point of view, what is it bottom-up or is it top-down?
Wait, I couldn't, what did you say?
The question is, Mussolini's fascism, is it a bottom-up theory or is it a top-down theory?
Top-down.
Plainly top-down, exactly. It's somebody who, look, everything within the state, right? The state is the source of all meaning. The state is the source of all rights, all liberties, and so on. And so he very clearly sees himself as a top-down theorist. And it seems to me that this, just because the other terms get used in so many different ways, is maybe more illuminating than thinking in terms of left and right. Now, what is fascism? If we think about that question, we realize it's hard to say. Historians give many different definitions of it. A lot of them conflict with each other. A lot of them are very confusing. It's popular among historians to say, well, there are the following 9, 10, or 11 features that are common in fascist movements, and it's hard to know how to get a definition out of that. Here are some of the common elements that historians point to. They often believe in a kind of revolutionary vanguard elite, a party that is a leadership party. They venerate the state. They are ultra-nationalistic, because you've got to develop people's allegiance to the state. They believe in violence and militarism. They believe in a mixed economy where the government has a large role to play. And yes, they have a distaste for all sorts of other things. This, by the way, is Mussolini judging some competition, and he was obviously unhappy with that competitor's entry. Indicated that by holding his nose. Yes, there's a bit of the militarism. Okay, so here are some definitions we might employ. Classical liberalism is the view that Mussolini holds up as his great enemy. This is what he's opposed to. These days, we tend to refer to this as libertarianism. It was known as classical liberalism back in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. Key figures are people like John Locke, John Stuart Mill. It's a system of social and economic organization, we could say, that emphasizes individual rights and liberties. It allows the government to act only to prevent harm to others. So sometimes this is called the vision of the night watchman state. What is the state there for? Basically to serve as a police force, to serve as a military. It's to keep people from harming each other directly. And that's its only role. So what would a government look like from this point of view? It would be a police force. Maybe a fire department, maybe. It would have a military, a Department of Defense. There wouldn't be much else, okay? A court system, so there would be a Department of Justice. But that's about it. It would really just keep people from hurting other people. Conservatism, we've defined as a system of social and economic organization that emphasizes ordered liberty. The individual's freedom to choose within a social order maintained by the rule of law and various private organizations. So the idea here is very close to classical liberalism, but the idea is, well, yes, liberty, absolutely, but within a structure. And so I've talked about some people like Calvin Coolidge who want to have government defining a framework for liberty. That ties in with this, because there's an emphasis on liberty, but also on the structure within which that liberty is exercised. And it's important that that be within a structure. Anarchy is not something the conservative would tend to like, even if people are leaving other people alone and not harming them. It's not enough to have anarchy with a police force. You actually have to have a kind of society that's organized enough that there are meaningful things to do. Well, there are other ways of understanding that, but since we're running out of time, I'm not going to worry about that. If you went to Roger Scruton's talk a few weeks ago, he defined conservatism as the love of one's own. And he, of course, uses Greek, because he always does, oikophilia. In any case, you could also define it as a philosophy of respect for people and people's choices. Socialism, we've defined as a system of social and economic organization that places key institutions under centralized conscious direction toward consciously chosen ends. So the idea here is that government is to act basically as we try to act in our individual lives. We intentionally make certain decisions. We have certain goals we intentionally adopt. We act in such a way as to achieve them. We do that consciously. And the idea is government's supposed to be like that. Government is supposed to consciously select its goals and consciously try to get there. Well, communism does this by actually having government own the means of production. The idea is that all of these things are to be taken over by the government. Communications, factories, farms, all of transportation, all of that is to be simply owned by the state. There's to be no private property, no private ownership of any of this. The government will not just consciously direct it through regulation or whatever, but will actually take it over and own it. What is fascism then? Here's what I've really been driving to. Well, it's a system that's pretty similar to that. It's a system of social and economic organization that places key institutions under centralized government control, but largely through indirect means, okay? Through regulation, through selection of directors, through government management labor boards, through various public-private partnerships, etc., as well as through direct ownership. So Mussolini will sometimes take industries over. In fact, it's said that he took over 3/4 of Italian industry. But to some extent, the fascist does this by regulation, by appointing key people to key positions, by having the government basically set up partnerships that allows the government to influence heavily what private companies and private institutions are doing. So that's the sense in which there's a mixed economy. It's partially privately owned, but it's heavily government directed. And so here is Mussolini, for example, sitting in an Italian motor car, talking to the board of, I think it's Alfa Romeo in this case. So we could see both communism and fascism as kinds of socialism anyway, if those definitions are correct. Whoa, battery. Don't tell me that. And in various ways, then it's really, its main opponent is classical liberalism, conservatism, various views on what we'd normally consider the right. Fascism is communitarian. It's everything in the state, whereas those other views are individualistic. It believes in no limits on government power, whereas there are limits and checks and balances according to classical liberalism and conservatism. It believes in the rights and liberties of government as opposed to the rights and liberties of the individual. And in fact, he says, yes, in the fascist conception of history, man is man only by virtue of the spiritual process to which he contributes, as a member of the family, the social group, the nation, and in function of history to which all nations bring their contribution. So, outside of history, man is a non-entity. Fascism is opposed to all individualistic abstractions, based on 18th century materialism. He's talking about Locke, he's talking about Jefferson, he's talking about Madison, he's talking about our founding fathers as pursuing these individualistic abstractions. He says, no, the pursuit of happiness, it doesn't believe in happiness. The state is all. The state is all embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist. All right, I've got 1 minute left to talk about what he actually wants to do. So, here's the program. We're going to have rule by a national council of experts. He limited the workday to 8 hours. He had a minimum wage, can help to foster unions, had a retirement age of 55, a national militia, a strong progressive tax on capital, seized church property, encouraged people to give their gold to the nation, took control of 3/4 of businesses, imposed wage and price controls, and then had a battle for wheat. Everything was a battle for Mussolini. There was never just the 5-year plan. It was a 5-year struggle. It was a battle for wheat. And so he did get people to grow more wheat, but that just meant they grew fewer other crops, so it didn't do much good. There was also a battle for land. He drained the Pontine marshes, but that didn't help very many people. And in the end, he instituted a propaganda program. All teachers had to swear a loyalty oath. All editors were appointed by Mussolini, and he built up this cult of personality around he himself.